about Evanston, and what do you think you can contribute to Evanston?
And thank you, David. Thank you, everybody, for welcoming me here. My name is Daniel Ramos. I am the Deputy City Administrator for the City of Baltimore. I grew up in Southeast LA in a small town called Bell Garden. I'm the proud son of two first-generation college students and the proud grandson of three Mexican immigrants. I started my career about as low as you can go here in the City of Baltimore as an intern and then subsequently as a mayoral fellow. I working with the fire department and our office of CityStat, which is the city's performance management arm, in order to reduce the amount of time that medic units were spending at hospital offloading patients. Created the first ever resource management system so we could work with our surrounding jurisdictions and the local hospitals on reducing that time. At the end of my fellowship, the then fire chief asked me to stay on as the first ever analyst for the agency. When I got there, they couldn't tell you basic things like who called 911 the most, for what, at what time. And so really helped the agency understand the data they had available and to make operational changes because of it. We were an all ALS system, which means that we were sending very highly trained paramedics who are essentially mobile trauma nurses to fevers and sprained ankles, et cetera, and really losing that some of that skill set. We changed the system to two-tiered, so we added EMTs and basic life support units to go to those calls so that when a heart attack came out, we were ready and had units available. From there, I went to the Department of Social Services as the Assistant Director of Innovation and Quality Assurance. They actually had a very similar job, data process improvement. The agency had a very well built out performance management system, but it was all counting. How many kids do we have in foster care? How many people did on federal benefits were employed? So pivoted the agency towards outcomes. We created the first ever outcome-based contracts. So people didn't get paid just for having somebody on their rolls or giving them a certification. They were getting paid when somebody got placed in a job, when somebody kept a job. Same on the child welfare side. We created a performance management template so that we were making placement decisions, not just on who was available, but who was making sure that kids were going to school and having good attendance, who was scoring well in English and math, and most importantly, who was keeping the kids stable, so not moving them under the arms of their umbrella, but keeping them in the same home. And most importantly, were they moving kids towards permanency? Were we getting that kid a full-time home, and permanent? From there, came back to City Hall as the operations manager and then the deputy budget director. Really there, I felt like my role and my value was to bridge the divide between, at the end of the yellow brick road of all of government's decisions and machinations, that there's a resident who needs a service and who expects a service. With balancing that with we need to be able to afford, something today, next week, a year from now, a decade from now. One of the things that I tried to practice was this concept of buying down risk. In the City of Baltimore, we haven't been able to capitalize our buildings, so we did a review of our facilities and looked at ones that had could be monetized. We worked with a private developer to do one of the local universities to do a public-private partnership where we moved Baltimore Police Department into a brand new academy, bringing them into compliance with the training and facility portion of their consent decree. And we also created a brand new public safety building in the former Baltimore Sun facility that had the Emergency Operations Center, a new Baltimore Central District, as well as other police functions. I did such a good job and had stepped up in so many different aspects. Then Mayor Young asked me to come on as the Deputy Chief of Staff, took a leadership role in the city's COVID response, managing a lot of the HR, the labor negotiations, the financial impacts of COVID. Like every city, we saw just huge cuts in our projected revenue, and because we had been prepared, because we had been working on a 10-year financial plan, we were ready. We made those cuts. We limited the service impact so that residents couldn't feel it, couldn't see it. And then at the end of Mayor Young's tenure and the beginning of Mayor Scott, I came on as the first ever Deputy City Administrator. I manage a portfolio of agencies, the Department of Transportation, Public Works, General Services, and IT. And I also manage all of the city's labor negotiations and relationships. David, would you mind saying the
Yes.
second part.
So why do you want to be the city manager of Evanston? What do you know about Evanston, and what do you think you can contribute to the community?
Got it. So I think why Evanston? When me and my wife were looking at places to move, we wanted some place that was diverse. We wanted somewhere that was an urban center or adjacent to an urban center. And most importantly, we wanted a place that shared our values. Evanston put a stake in the ground by creating a reparations program and put a stake in the ground in permanently eviscerating legacy policies that were inherently racist. I think that is something that the nation should aspire to. That is something I feel like I can add value to. One of the things that I've worked on and successfully implemented was the city's first ever cash assistance program. When we were in the very heart of COVID, we were looking at what do people need, what do residents need from us, and we were providing food, we were providing shelter, but we weren't providing anything general. So things like your cell phone bill, electricity, water bills, et cetera, was getting ignored under all of the different layers of government programming. So worked with a local foundation as well as 13 community-based organizations to successfully implement a cash assistance program that hit 15,000 needy families. The one thing that I like to share, and while I may be young, I am definitely battle tested. I was in the Emergency Operations Center during Freddie Gray, during the Baltimore uprising. I managed the state's emergency shelters during the largest snowstorm in Maryland history. And I've taken a lead during COVID. I've continued to progress my career and move up in responsibility under 4 different mayors. So I feel like that is something that I am prepared. I know Evanston is in a point of transition. All local governments are looking towards how are we reimagining services in the post-COVID world.
Thank you, Daniel. Daniel, talk about what experience do you have in dealing with diverse communities?
So I feel, so I will admit that I have spent my entire career in Baltimore. And so there's a little bit of a Baltimore lens to which I take to a lot of things. But Baltimore is incredibly diverse, 60% African-American, growing Latino population, not just in racial diversity, but also in economic diversity. We have, a world-class waterfront, and we have some neighborhoods that have whole blocks that are vacant. So a lot of familiarity. I'm not from Baltimore. Everything that you see, all the things I've accomplished, I came, I learned, I worked, and was able and made the relationships necessary to get things done.
Okay, thank you. How would you specifically address systematic racism issues? Are you familiar with Evanston's racial reparations program, and how would you go about implementing it?
Yeah, I'm familiar with Evanston's reparations program. I feel it aligns very closely with some of the work that I've done. One of the things that I've led on behalf of Mayor Scott was a reform of the city's tax sale system. This is the process by which the city sells mostly tax lien, but also water and environmental citation liens of properties to private debt collectors who can charge up to a 12% premium. And if the homeowners aren't able to pay, actually go into foreclosure. When we did the data analysis, the overwhelming demographic was older African-American seniors. This was a practice that was inherently racist, was inherently discriminatory, and shifted generational wealth from families to private debt collectors. I was charged with doing the reform. I believe that you need to have 2 plans. The first plan is, what are you doing to staunch the bleeding? How are you repairing the hole in the ship? I met with our attorneys, with our budget staff, with our Department of Housing, to understand what authority the city had in order to impact this, in order to help people. We had the authority to remove all owner-occupied properties that had been there in the first time. So great, we did it. Mayor Scott announced that last May. We also knew that we had federal funding available to be able to keep folks in their home. So any of the folks that we couldn't touch we were able to buy those liens back, to get those folks back to square one. We also started with an eye towards long term. We started a tax sale steering committee that had a diverse set of not just the tax lien purchasers, but advocates and city agencies, in order to understand the whole scope of the process and the issue, make recommendations for changes to legislation, make recommendations to make changes to city operations so that we can be more equitable in that service. So in terms of what I would do, really understanding the legislation, meeting with the advocates that help create and the elected officials who help create that program, to understand where they're going from, to take a deep dive into the history of Evanston and the necessity for this legislation and what its end goal. I believe that you have to have we have to start with, what do we want? And if we want to be more equitable, if we want to make reparations, let's work backwards from there.
Okay. Thank you. Daniel, talk about what experience you have in implementing municipal climate action plans, and what elements of Evanston's current plan would you prioritize implementing as city manager, and what, if anything, do you think is missing from that plan?
Got it. So I have a lot of familiarity with climate action, with climate resiliency. I manage the Department of Public Works. There, we started the city's first ever blue bin container program. So we had a dedicated bin for recycling. A Department of Transportation, promoting multimodal, promoting bike use, expanding our bike network, as well as creating, doing a debt plan in order to replace all of the city's street lights to LED. I was part of the group that did the financial management to look. Climate action is not just a policy, a social policy. It is very much a financial one. We're seeing more and more the impact of climate change on all cities, especially one like Baltimore, which is adjacent to the water. And then, as well as the Department of General Services, one of the things that I'm very proud of is we vacated over 1 million square feet of city-owned property. This property wasn't weatherized. It didn't have modern HVAC. It didn't have any of the modern electrical that would reduce its carbon footprint. And we were very inefficiently using it. And we moved all of the units within those facilities into a private facility that had all those modern. It significantly reduced the city's electrical bill and its carbon footprint. The thing I will tell you, the part that I am most excited about within the Evanston plan, and the part that I am very familiar with, is that facility. Like all cities, a lot of these buildings reflect a different generation and a different generation of needs. They are not always kept up to that gold standard, that LED standard, that LEED standard. For their footprint. I also would like to look at the city's fleet, making sure that we have the fleet replacement program that will continue to bring in the latest technology that reduces the city's carbon footprint from that perspective.
Daniel, talk about your experience with affordable housing, and what can you do to increase affordable housing in Evanston?
Got it. So in terms of affordable housing, the thing that I most closely touched was we did an analysis of the city's tax credits. We had a tax credit system that reflected the city's values of years ago, which was subsidizing luxury apartments, multifamily, and not always necessarily not necessarily affordable. So in Evanston, one of my first acts would be to do the review of the city's tax rate, the city's tax credits, all of the financial incentives that the city gives, and make sure that they're geared towards affordable. In a city like Evanston, which is landlocked, it is only 8 square miles. Looking at where are those opportunities, whether that's conversion of current older stock, making sure that we're prepared to work with the county and the state to subsidize to subsidize in some way to make sure that there's a return on investment for affordable, as well as looking at the city facilities, if there's ways to condense buildings or to do public-private partnerships that we know that those facilities are getting repurposed into what we want.
Okay, thank you. Can you describe how you have increased transparency for residents in your previous positions?
Got it. So one of the things that I helped facilitate was a complete change in how the city did community outreach for its budget. When I started, we did the vast majority of that outreach in the winter and the spring when the budget is mostly cooked. We hired a dedicated community outreach and equity coordinator because that was what we needed to do. We started doing the outreach in the summer and the fall to make sure that we were being authentic and we could look communities in the eye and say that we're here to listen. We're here to take this input into consideration. We also did try to modernize some of these community outreach. We did a Reddit AMA, we did a Facebook Live, we did the things to meet people where they are. Not just that, I talked to every single council member and I said, we will go to every single community meeting that we get invited to, whether that be at night, whether that be on weekends, that we would be there to explain and be able to stand behind the city's budget and help to educate the residents on how it worked and why we were where we are. One program I'm very proud of creating was the city's Data Fellow program. In my experience as an analyst, what I discovered is that not every agency was ready to hire a data person to be able to take that data and make it public or to infuse it into the day-to-day operations. So what we did was we created a program. We hired a fellow coordinator that would hire and train very talented folks, mostly in the beginning parts of their career, who wanted to pivot from their private sector or from other types of jobs into government. We placed them in agencies that had data-driven problems or problems that could be solved by data. And most of them had some component of transparency, whether that was bringing to light where overdoses were occurring, whether that was the occupancy of the convention center and what types of events we were holding. All those kind of help support becoming a more data-driven and transparent city.
Thank you. Daniel, what will you do to support small businesses in Evanston and to attract businesses to fill vacancies in commercial properties?
Got it. So not to sound like a broken record, but I do think reviewing the city's tax system, the incentives, and more broadly, the incentives to look at where the city is spending money and making sure that it is aligned to that small business. I think it's working with the county and the state to make sure that we're supporting current small businesses or small businesses who may want to move with us to maximize any of the programs, especially with COVID, any of the COVID-related programs, in order to do the types of things like improving technology or improving facades or creating space to be outdoors or social distance within their business.
Okay. Please explain how you decide budgetary priorities. In other words, which projects and programs receive funding when resources are limited?
Got it. Thank you, David. So I do have a lot of expertise in managing tight budgets. Just for context, the city of Baltimore, 36% of the city's population is on a federal benefit. We have about 14,000 vacant properties, so it's just huge. And those are on levels of Detroit, East St. Louis, Memphis, a very poor city. We have structural deficits caused by a lack of investment on the capital side, as well as like many other cities, pension and healthcare deficits. So have had a lot of experience in really eking out efficiencies in terms of in terms of maximizing the dollar, maximizing the limited dollars. It's really about impact. I think one of the most important things for Evanston, should I take the job, help facilitate, is to create a strategic plan. I'm a firm believer that cities need North Stars, that, we need to have the thing that we all wake up in the morning. When I started, when I started under Mayor Rawlings Blake, it was 10,000 families. The city was going to recruit 10,000 families. And when things came in the budget or capital projects were being reviewed, how did that project lead to 10,000 more families? So I think it's about creating that North Star, creating the goals that the city, and working backwards from there so that every dollar that we're spending aligns with that.
The city seems to pay exorbitant prices for projects and then gets quality that is subpar that requires expensive fixes. How can you prevent this from happening in the future?
Yeah, I think first and foremost is looking at the procurement laws, policies, and personnel. I think it's about making sure that we're bidding in such a way that creates enough space for us to be choosy about what the projects are. It's about creating the controls with the home agencies to make sure that those change orders are being reviewed by the finance department, being reviewed by the city manager, and there's a sense of accountability for the projects being over. I think it's about managing the vendor, managing vendors' expectations on what the project needs to be, and then holding them accountable when the project is not up to snuff.
Okay. Daniel, what will you do to improve productivity, service, and accountability with the city staff? Maybe giving some examples from your previous position.
Got it. So I think first and foremost, it's creating a structure that makes sense, that there are clear lines of accountability, there are clear lines of communication, there's a structured decision-making process on how to get things in and out of my office and with the elected officials and back down to the folks who are actually doing the work. I think the second part is creating a performance management system. Like I talked about in the fire department, it was really taking a deep dive into their data. It was working with the Office of City Stat to make sure that what they were going to be reviewing aligned with what the goals of the mayor or the goals of the fire chief. That we were working with the third parties that helped impact our data. So the area hospitals, the local healthcare providers, et cetera. When I was at DSS, it was about restructuring on how we being more data driven and how we made decisions, that we created templates, performance management templates for each of the individual units that I could track on a day-to-day basis the number of kids in foster care and make sure that when I saw the number of kids going up, that we had an understanding. Was it because we were bringing more kids in? Were we slowing the number of adoptions or reunifications? So that I can provide that information to the director and with the deputy director, so that we can start making changes now, that we didn't let it become a habit. Here as a deputy city administrator, I work very closely with the Office of City Stat on something called Clean Stat, and that's a general review of all of the agency's performance who touch cleanliness. So the Department of Public Works for trash pickup, for vacant house boarding, for graffiti removal, et cetera, to make sure that we have goals and that we're adhering to it. And when we're not adhering to it, that we're understanding why, whether that's staffing issues from COVID, whether that's fleet, and I need to work with the Department of General Services to make sure that we're getting load packers in and out faster to keep operations going, transportation for mowing of medians and other transportation projects, or the Department of General Services that we're maintaining our facilities and our rec centers, our recreational centers. So I think it's about creating those performance templates, that we have goals that we're adhering to, that they're being regularly checked. And then when they aren't being met, or when they're being far exceeded, that we understand why and are prepared to redeploy resources in real time.
Thank you. The city's portion of property taxes is higher than neighboring communities. What strategies will you look at to make the city's share of the property taxes more manageable?
So I think that it's really about understanding the budget. It's understanding where are we doing financial planning? Are we doing financial projections to look at how we're doing quarter to quarter, year to year, when revenues aren't meeting the expected operations, that we're able to change, that we have a 10-year financial plan, or a series of options that we're prepared to do, that we're prepared to act on when necessary, when there are budget crunches. I think it's about looking at the city's fixed costs, whether that's fleet, facilities, pension, healthcare. It's looking at all of those, understanding the changes in costs year to year, and seeing what we can do to manage around them. And so I think, and it's also, again, tying back the budgeting to what the strategic plan is. One of the things that I would want to introduce in the city's budget book is, when we're describing agencies' budgets, that is connected to performance. What are we getting at? How many widgets are being created? How quickly are we making them? What is the outcome? How is the citizenry better because we spent that dollar?
Okay, thank you. Daniel, what do you think the city's role with Northwestern University should be? And talk about experiences you've had working with colleges and universities.
Got it. I'm very familiar with this. For context, the city of Baltimore has University of Maryland as well as Johns Hopkins. We are only 11% of the state's population, but make up almost 70% of the tax-exempt land. So very familiar with this issue. First, I want to recognize that it is a good thing to have these institutions in the city. They provide sometimes the current and the future residents of Evanston. They provide, in some cases, world-class services to their customers. But I think it's about balancing. It's about understanding what the points of leverage are, whether that's a bed tax or something similar, so that the city could go in prepared to negotiate something like payment in lieu of taxes or a pilot. Have a full understanding of what the institution is providing, making sure that any policy choice or any negotiations is couched in. You don't want to take a sledgehammer and not a scalpel to the process, because you might catch a local nonprofit or local church that could be impacted by a policy decision. So I think it's about understanding all of those things, the value they provide, the gap between the value they provide and how much that their tax payment would be without the tax exempt status. It's holding them accountable to commitments that they've made in the past, and then it's understanding those points of leverage to make sure that the city is getting the best possible deal.
Thank you. Talk about your experience in coming up with strategies to reduce crime, and how can you apply that to Evanston?
Thank you, David. So I don't have a direct oversight role of the Baltimore Police Department or any of the criminal justice oriented agencies, but I have worked very closely on different aspects of the Baltimore Police Department's consent decree. I've worked with them on modernizing their facility and fleet. I've worked with them on modernizing their training and IT. I feel very strongly that one of the keys and one of the things I've successfully done is civilianizing the police department, so that police officers are solving crime. They're not doing administrative functions, that they're being focused, that they're being trained, that they're spending as much time in the classroom as they are interacting with the public. I think it is important to make sure that the police department has both informal and formal relationships with the surrounding jurisdictions, including Chicago, including the local ATF, to make sure that there's data sharing available to be able to solve crimes, so that when people know that when they commit crimes that we're finding them and they're going through the criminal justice process. I think also in relation to youth violence, and I saw that one of the first ARP announcements was an investment to reduce youth violence. I think it's important for the city to find partners to provide the cognitive therapy necessary for these youth, so that when they're at the point where crime is their best option, that they're getting the mental health resources they need to try to pivot their lives. I also think it's important and I see that Mayor Bliss has started the Reimagining Public Safety Committee. I think that work is irreplaceable, that we need to make sure that we have the partnerships in the mental health and addiction, that we're diverting as many calls from PD towards a health professional.
Okay. Thank you. One of the questions that came up in our chat box, talk about your experience dealing with an active community where there's a lot of contentious issues and how you've handled that.
Okay. Yeah, I think that, in a city like Baltimore that has had such strong financial constraints and such high both capital and operating needs, we have that a very strong community engagement, or very communities with very strong engagement with the city. Like I mentioned in the budget office, I felt it was important to take a stand publicly with our council to say that we would go and meet with every single organization that wanted to meet with us, that I had the requisite knowledge and comfort with the policy, with the financials, with the operations, to go and speak intelligently and confidently about where the direction the city was heading. I think that one of the things that attracted me to Evanston is that engaged community, not just informally, but also formally in the forms of all of the different citizen committees that are within the charter. I want to make sure that those have very clear missions, that they are staffed properly, that their feedback is coming back not just to me, but it being pushed down to all levels of government.
Thank you. Talk about your experience in acquiring grant funds for projects.
Yeah, so I managed I was the deputy in the budget office. The city of Baltimore receives hundreds of millions of dollars worth of grants. I think it's first understanding what grants the city currently has, whether there's capacity to go and ask for more, particularly on the private side, where we've been able to show a return on investment for those grants and have the capacity to expand it and just need the dollar. I have a lot of familiarity with the federal grants and which ones the city of Evanston would be eligible to go and get. I think it's important to have a centralized grant office or unit that's able to work to provide the technical assistance to agencies who apply, to help create some standardization so that agencies aren't applying for the same grant for different things, that we have a working relationship with the local philanthropy community. I think that's it.
Okay, thank you. Evanston used to be a place people from the North Shore and beyond came for dining, shopping, and culture. How do you think Evanston can bring back the vitality that they used to have as we exit the pandemic?
Yeah, so I think it's important for the city to understand all of the resources that are out there, to know the county, the state, and the federal resources that are geared towards revitalizing communities and industries impacted by COVID. I think it's about providing resources through the local development authority or the local tourism bureau to make sure that they're equipped with all those things, and the city is prepared to have skin in the game and help provide subsidies to projects to make sure that we are still in the middle of COVID, and we are still and we don't know when it's going to end. So making sure that all those investments are sustainable, that we're creating things not just for today, but from a year from now, if we're still in this situation. I want to work. I'm here in Baltimore on various things. I work very closely with the local tourism bureau. We helped develop a hotel grant program. We've also done millions of dollars worth of direct grants, both locally and federally funded.
Thank you. Evanston is preparing to update its comprehensive plan, which is its blueprint and vision for the future. How would you approach the planning process for the plan to ensure maximum resident and stakeholder participation?
I think it's first working with the mayor and council to make sure that there is some agreement on some of the pillars. One, the mission statement, the vision statement, the North Star that I keep referring to, the pillars that are going to help guide that. I think it's important that there's a project manager who is prepared to go and host these community forums, that we're reaching folks in every medium, whether that's in print, whether that's via email, whether that's through our social media, and most importantly in person, COVID allowing. I think that these goals are the bedrock for moving the city forward.
Thank you. Can you talk a little bit about being visible in the community? How were you in Baltimore, and how would you approach that in Evanston?
I think it's making that same agreement that when organizations want to host me, that I'm going to be there, that I'm attentive to community leaders' calls, that I'm working with the council to make sure that I'm leveraging their relationships with community leaders, with community organizations, and other city partners to make sure that they know me, they see me, that I'm able to articulate a vision for the city, and can speak intelligently and confidently about what we're doing, and be able to take that feedback and help to intertwine it with the city's day-to-day operations.
Okay, thanks. How would you help enhance mobility around Evanston and visitors who don't drive a car?
Got it. Here in Baltimore, I manage the Department of Transportation, where we've had a very distinct pivot towards multimodal, making sure that our capital projects and our street resurfacing are up to the ADA standard, that we're expanding the city's bike network where available, that we are upgrading the city's bus infrastructure, both the stops as well as possibly dedicated bus lanes. Looking at the city's parking and making sure that we're using all of the modern tools, that if where possible, that we're having folks turn over the spots with surge parking, and that we have dedicated Uber and Lyft stops in order to make sure that for folks who don't want to drive and who don't want to pay a parking, that there's an ability to seamlessly get dropped off and get picked up.
Okay, thank you. One of the tasks of the new manager will be to hire a new police chief. What are the types of qualities you would be looking for in a police chief?
Right. I'm very proud to work with Commissioner Harrison. I think he has brought some transformational change to the agency. I want somebody who's balanced, who has had the experience of managing the organization, the administration, the financial, has had experience moving towards this restorative justice concept and literature, that understands the importance of community, that wants, not just understands, but wants to move towards a better trained police force, that is open and willing to use public health interventions and 911 diversion as a part of the crime fighting.
Okay, thanks. Kind of another related police issue. So talk about your experience with community policing in minority neighborhoods, and basically anything in the record in terms of the use of force against minority population in Baltimore.
So even before the events of last summer that has been a catalyst for a lot of these conversations. The city of Baltimore in 2015 went through Freddie Gray. I've worked for the city. I worked for the city then, and have continued to work with the city. In the aftermath of that, I think first and foremost, it's doing a hard and if necessary, finding outside resources to do a hard review of the use of force policies. It's doing asking ourselves hard questions about whether the training that we're providing officers reflects what our goal is, which is a reduction in officer folks. I also, am a big believer in making sure that officers are out of their cars, that they're hitting the beats, that they are actively doing proactive patrols, so that when they go into communities, it's not the first time that they've seen that officer. It's not the first time that they've met somebody, that the local business owners know them, and start to rebuild some of that trust that has been lost over the last decades.
Great. Back to another finance question. So what is your view of the use of debt in terms of how to pay for spending in a city budget?
So I'm a firm believer that you shouldn't be using debt to cover gaps from a year to year. I think that the city needs to have sound financial policies that develops a fund balance and a rainy day fund that is able to be used to bridge, unexpected, whether that's, a facility malfunction or a weather event, a natural disaster. That we are financially sound and have available resources to bridge us year to year, so that debt isn't necessary. One of the things that I've worked on with the finance department and the IT department is making sure that we're matching the debt instrument to the life cycle of the investment. So we had for many years been using general obligation 20-year bonds to pay for IT. That doesn't make any sense because most IT has a 3 to 5 year useful life. So making sure that we worked with our Treasury Department and our debtors to be able to create that shorter term financing, so that we're keeping the most modern technology on throughout the city. I do think that it really is a comment that it's part of the budget. Like when we do the financial forecast for the final year, we have a exact understanding of how much debt we're expecting to pay, what the city's debt capacity is, what that relationship is with the bond agencies, and making sure that we're maintaining that high level credit rating. I do think that debt is a useful tool, especially for some of these larger projects. I also think the city should explore public-private partnerships where it's not going to a bank to get a loan, but it's finding the parts of the city's operation where it can be monetized, whether that's recycling or composting or something like that, where the private developer takes on the risk of the capital outlay, and the city pays it back over time where it makes sense.
Daniel, there's a question in the chat room about there's a Baltimore Transit Equity Coalition report on transit inequity in Baltimore. What is your plan to address those issues? If you're familiar with it, I assume. So
yeah. So
okay.
Like I've mentioned, Baltimore is the home of decades worth of disinvestment from federal and state partners, as well as just having an incredible financial struggles. From the time of that report being issued to where we are now, it is a very different Department of Transportation. We hired Director Sharkey, who has changed the direction of that city from prioritizing cars to prioritizing multimodal. Dedicated bike lanes have done a citywide signal change to make sure that we're prioritizing east-west transportation, where a lot of the transportation inequity was happening. We worked with the state and our surrounding jurisdictions to apply for and then have been subsequently awarded a RAISE grant, which will completely refurbish dozens of miles of bus infrastructure to make sure that we're prioritizing east-west transportation, where we're getting folks from where they live to where the job centers are around. We're also refurbishing we just issued an RFP to reform the city circulator. We're going through the public comments right now to make sure that the circulator is not just able to, is not set in what was needed 10 years ago, but is being developed with an eye towards, for 10 years from now.
Okay, thanks. Daniel, getting a couple other police questions in the chat box. So talk about your experience and position on police oversight, accountability, and transparency.
So I think that those are essential hallmarks of a healthy police department. One of the things that we've done here in the city of Baltimore was to completely reform as a part of our labor negotiations, civilian review panels for those use of forces, for those disciplinary actions. I think that we've created a new policy and how and when we release footage of body cameras. If I'm not 100% sure the city of Evanston already has them, but if they don't, then that'd be one of my first items, was to be moved the agency in that direction. I think that it needs direct oversight. One of the things that we did and we advocated for at the state level was to get local control. It had been a state agency since the Civil War, and Mayor Scott was able to advocate successfully to put it on the ballot and a referendum in order for it to be locally managed and controlled.
Okay. I think, Pam, were you going to ask a question?
Daniel,
Yeah.
in response to large expenditures with questionable motivation, there was a movement to put a large-scale project on a referendum in Evanston. What do you think of giving residents that kind of voice?
I think that's a case by case. I think there might be a reason. There's a threshold, like where underneath that, I would feel uncomfortable that we need to keep the machine of government moving, and it may not be necessary. It may not be worth the residents' time to do a referendum and do that wholesale review. I think that I'm open to it. I think that there's a certain threshold where, especially in a city like Evanston that has such a engaged community and active citizenry, that it does go up. I also want to make sure that I'm working with the council to facilitate as much community engagement on those large scale projects as humanly possible, that the experts that are working on this within the city of Evanston are made available, that we're able to explain the motivation and the financing behind any of these projects.
Thank you, Daniel. With our time wrapping up here, is there any final statement you'd like to make to the Evanston community, or anything we didn't ask that you'd like to talk about?
I want to thank everybody for having me. This has been truly a special honor in my career to be here, to be able to make my case for being the next city manager for Evanston. I feel like when you think about the scope of everything that a city does, that I have touched it in some way, whether that's be public safety, whether that's fire, whether that's public health interventions, social services, budgeting, strategic planning, emergency management, snow removal, and sustainability. Those are all things that I have touched, that I have successfully managed. I feel confident that my history in Baltimore, coming from Southeast LA to here and rising from an intern to the deputy city administrator, shows that I have a great respect for residents, for community, learning the history, and we'll be able to replicate that in the city of Evanston.
All right. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much,
Yeah.
Daniel. We appreciate your time. As mentioned, we'll look forward to seeing you later this week in Evanston.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye. We will have Mr. Michael Jasso joining us in just a few minutes. I'd like to give everybody an opportunity to take a quick break. And so if everyone's back, it's in say 10 minutes or so. That'll give everyone to take a break, get some water, as the case may be. All of this is being recorded, so all of your questions in the chat are being recorded so that if there are some questions that we didn't get to, we can ask those. We'll let the council know that some of these, they'll be able to look at them and maybe ask them during their time. There are a couple of the panels with the candidates on Thursday and Friday, so that some of those responses can be provided. I did put a link to the survey so that you can provide feedback on the candidate, on their strengths and weaknesses. That will be on the city's website as well. I'm going to go ahead and share that link right now while we're on the break, and so that you can go in and share your feedback about the candidates. But thank you so much. We'll take a quick break. We'll share the link and we'll be back at about 5:10.
Good afternoon. For those of you who joined us later in our last session, I am Pam Derby with CPS HR Consulting, and my colleague David Niemeyer will be asking the questions today. We have about 13 questions that are a synopsis of those questions that were submitted online and via the 311. There were 73 respondents, and so it's not possible, obviously, to ask that many questions in this type of form when we have about 50 to 60 minutes. But please feel free to also submit via the chat if you'd like to, and we will try to get to some of those. I do think that most of the things that people were interested in, we were able to cover in the last session. This is being recorded, and the recording will be available on the city's website. In addition, there is transcription at the bottom. So for those of you that may have difficulty, obviously, you can also read the transcription. But with that, I'm going to turn this over to David Niemeyer. The other thing I would add is that there is a SurveyMonkey link for you to go in and provide feedback regarding the candidates if you like. I'll share that several times during the session, and we will also share it. It'll be shared on the city's website as well. And so the city council will not be meeting the candidates until the end of the week on Friday. So they will have had an opportunity to see all of your feedback. But with that, I'm going to turn it over to David. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you,
and
Pam.
welcome.
Thank you, Pam, and welcome again, Michael. So first question is, tell us a little bit about yourself. Why do you want to be the city manager of Evanston? What do you know about Evanston, and what specifically do you think you can contribute to Evanston?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you, David and Pam, for facilitating this conversation with the community. Thank you very much to the Evanston community for taking a Sunday afternoon out to get to know the two candidates for the role of city manager. I think the statistics that Pam gave in terms of number of questions is evident of the interest and really the quality of the citizenry in Evanston in terms of their interest in making the community a better place. So a little bit about myself. I was born and raised in Chicago on the southwest side in the back of the yards. I'm one of 7 kids. My father was emigrated from Mexico City to Chicago to work at the time when he was in his early 20s. My mom was born in Chicago, went to school, high school, through school and high school in the Chicago area. Subsequently received a BA in architecture, a Bachelor of Arts in Architecture from Princeton University. And after that, after serving in the Peace Corps for 2 years in Sana'a, Yemen, returned to Chicago, worked in the Chicago area, and then went on to get my MBA at the University of Texas at Austin. Professionally, over my life, I've spent over, I think, 15 to 17 years as an adult working in Chicago, principally either at the city of Chicago ultimately as the Managing Deputy Commissioner for the Department of Housing and Economic Development, now the Department of Planning and Development, or as Bureau Chief for Cook County, which was my most recent stint with respect to my work experience before coming to Sacramento. I've been knowledgeable about Evanston for most of my life, and I'm not exaggerating that from a standpoint. I almost went to Northwestern. I ultimately decided not to pursue going to Northwestern, and instead attended Princeton, but a lot of my friends went there. As an adult, spent a lot of time in Evanston, either going to events there, dining there, going to the cinemas that I know are no longer in downtown Evanston, unfortunately. My brother was married in Evanston at the Orrington Hotel, so spent a lot of time in Evanston. And I think that speaks to what attracts me to it. Evanston is really an iconic community, rich history, not only in the context of Illinois and in the 1850s and 60s as it was started, and the university was started there, but nationally, a lot of rich history there and communities. That being said, Evanston is also a real city. It's a real city with real issues, and that's attractive to me. I've worked in a lot of different cities besides those, or municipal contexts besides those I've mentioned. I've worked in DC as a special assistant to the mayor for doing tax increment finance. I've now worked in Sacramento as assistant city manager for a 500,000 plus rapidly growing city. And what attracts me is similar to the things that attracted me to come to Sacramento. Evanston is the right size in terms of being able to pilot a course that I think can really be exemplary of how cities. The fact is that most of Illinois looks a lot more like Evanston, not like Chicago, notwithstanding my love and interest in the city of Chicago and having grown up there. And I think under the right leadership, Evanston can really set a course that is an example, not just to Illinois, but the nation, of what does it mean to be a city of that size with real issues, grow in a way that reflects its community, that is thoughtful about inclusion and equity, that takes advantage of some very real assets that the town that the city has. I know at some point I'm sure we'll talk about the town-gown relationships in Northwestern. But I think my experience both in the Chicagoland area, one knowing the various parties in the Chicagoland, whether it's parties at Cook County, or I worked with Evanston when I was with Cook County, but also learning from the examples I've been fortunate to be involved in, whether it's DC or more recently now the city of Sacramento. So all those things came together. It's a unique opportunity for a unique city. It was very attractive to me as a place that I still call home in terms of the Chicago area. And you take advantage of those when they come up.
Thank you, Mike. What experience do you have dealing with diverse communities?
So I think quite a bit. Both everywhere I've worked, whether it was the city of Chicago, whether it was Cook County, whether it was Washington, D.C., or now Sacramento, are very diverse communities. Arguably, Sacramento today, in a 2012 Harvard study on ethnicity and race, ranked Sacramento the most diverse city in the United States, and it truly is. It's really an amazing cosmopolitan. But diversity doesn't mean equity. I want to be clear about that. Nor does it mean that it solves all. It's part of the equation, and it I think reflects where we as a nation are going in terms of doing that. But being comfortable working in your communities, whether those are the communities that are most prevalent in a city like Sacramento or Evanston, our African-American community, our growing Hispanic community, as well as new immigrants there, I think is critically important, because cities that are successful, any place, are those cities that realize we can't leave any population group behind. And that's the fundamental premise on equity, which is that it's a waste of assets in terms of those people that are in community. And I think it's a critically important lens that you go through. There's a social imperative of why we are concerned about how we deal across our populations. It's the right thing to do. It's fairness and expresses our value. But there's also a business imperative, which is we need all our communities to succeed and succeed equally in order to truly harness the economic potential that our community represents, in this case, Evanston.
Thank you. How would you specifically address systematic racism issues? And are you familiar with Evanston's racial reparations program, and how would you implement it?
So I think the first is always data, right? Which is that number one, understanding where our community is. It's actually in some ways a lot easier in a city like Evanston, Northeastern Illinois, or communities. Here in California, we are hampered by specific legislation that says we cannot ask questions on race. So we're always figuring out roundabout ways to try to figure out, well, what's the actual impact of unemployment in our Hispanic community or African American community, and how do we as a city, along with our many partners, including the state, the private sector, the philanthropic sectors, work to mitigate that. So the first piece is better understanding the impact of inequities in the community itself. The second is being very deliberate on our strategies of when we invest, how we are trying to equalize the playing field. And I think it is very important that the pursuit of equity and inclusion is a process, not just a goal. It is about how we reflect, how we make decisions on a moving forward basis. And the fact that we have marginalized communities that have been underinvested historically is not something that's going to change overnight, but it's also not going to change unless we make deliberate steps as we move forward. So looking at those things through a variety of lenses is critically important. Looking at where we impact businesses and how we impact particularly small businesses, I think is important, and being attentive to those disparities in our residents in terms of housing, in terms of employment, how we think about strategies. I will also contend that a city like Evanston can't do it alone. We have to do it in partnerships with other agencies, whether it's the state, whether it's things like the Chicago Cook Workforce Partnership, as we develop strategies that are centralized on Evanston's specific issues and challenges, but also are tied into the broader belief that Evanston operates as part of a larger economy, and how do we reflect what we need to do, but also don't lose sight of the fact that we need to push all our neighbors and partners to do better.
Thank you. What experience do you have in implementing municipal climate action plans, and what elements of Evanston's current plan would you prioritize implementing, and is there anything missing from their plan?
So I'm a couple of things. One, what experience do we have? Here in Sacramento, we've been very active. We do have a climate action plan that has been adopted by the city council, and we are currently in the process of identifying prioritizations. One of the things we have brought forward to city council, not specifically under my direction, it's a collective work of the work I do heading up economic development in Sacramento, and building and zoning, various other things, along with our public works departments, is prioritizing certain efforts. We recently adopted some legislative platform where, for instance, all new buildings in Sacramento need to be all electric by 2026. We are, in terms of multifamily, what's excluded are single family homes for the time being. So it's multifamily. We are currently grappling with how do we deal with existing kind of buildings, and realizing it's not just a regulatory framework. You can't just say you got to do this without figuring out how do you actually make it possible for building owners, businesses, and homes. So we are looking at various ways to incent that through lowering fees in terms of cost of producing kind of those buildings. Sacramento has one of the largest fleets of bikes and scooters and various other things in the United States. We as a city, this is where city action comes in very strongly. We are greatly expanding our fleet of EV vehicles such that by 2026, I think over half our EVs will be all electric. But in order to do that, we also have to be very deliberate about how we invest in infrastructure. You know, you can't have an all EV fleet without having a significant expansion of our charging stations. So these are all pieces that I've worked on in concert with my colleagues here in Sacramento. I am going to be honest and say I'm less familiar with what Evanston has put on the table. I applaud Evanston for leading this, because it can't just be certain places that are doing it. And I think it's important for cities like Evanston, and this is what's attractive about Evanston, to take the lead in leading its peer cities in Cook County, the other 131 municipalities in Cook County, the many more municipalities in Northeastern Illinois, in adopting strategies because it really needs to, in adopting climate action strategies, it really needs to be broad-based, not just one discrete municipality taking on those efforts.
Thank you, Michael. And we've got plenty of time, so slow down a bit and take your time as we go through this. So what is your experience with affordable housing, and what can you do to increase affordable housing in Evanston?
Sure. Affordable housing is also one of those topics that you can act locally, but the reality is that in order to address it fully, it needs to be a more comprehensive conversation with the other communities. So my experience in affordable housing is multi-front. At Cook County, one of the things we did was use extensively our financial resources to work with the Housing Authority of Cook County in the production of more regulated affordable housing. In terms of financing through CDBG funds, home funds, ESG to the extent that it's applicable. There's been a lot of new funding that's come down the pike recently, both at the federal level, in our case of California, the state level. So financing is an important tool, bringing and making more financing available, or going after financing that may be available through the state, county, federal government. But the reality is we also need to look at other things. So for instance, here in Sacramento, we were the first city in the state of California to push through zero impact fees on all affordable housing throughout the city. A huge step in a state where the cost of delivering housing is incredibly high. The cost of the median home price in California is close to $500,000. And to deliver, whether it's single family homes or multifamily housing, you're building your way. You can't just build your way or subsidize your way out of it. Another thing that we're doing is trying to see if there's models that we can work with private developers that will particularly address funding for housing for that middle income, that 80 to 120% of AMI, that is incredibly difficult to get at because historically tax credits don't really hit that place. But we know it's a huge issue in terms of keeping our working class being able to afford housing, whether it's rental, whether it's ownership in our communities. Some of those are examples that I would like to pursue. I'm fortunate that I have maintained good working relationships with the many partners that deliver affordable housing in a community like Evanston, Illinois, whether it's through IDA, the Illinois Housing Development Authority, county funding, state funding, as well as various other federal programs that are either in the works. But at the end of the day, we all know that the need for a much greater supply of affordable housing, reducing the cost of that housing, and then reducing entry for residents into that housing. So there's long and short is that there's no one silver bullet. There's lots of tactics that a city like Evanston can and should be undertaking, but they also need to realize that those tactics need to be examined in partnerships with the many other players that exist in a state like Illinois that can help Evanston deliver more affordable housing.
Thank you. Michael, can you describe how you have increased transparency for residents in your previous positions?
Sure. I think one of the things I'll focus on most recently here in Sacramento. So when I came to Sacramento, and Sacramento is really an amazing community, we were I would say we were very siloed in terms of what we do. And one of my firm beliefs is that everything a city does at the end of the day is economic development, in the sense that it creates economic opportunities for all its residents. How we invest in public infrastructure, how we provide public safety on our streets, everything adds to the equation of creating opportunities and security for our residents in terms of creating a viable place for them to live. So a couple of things we did was, when I first came on, one of the things that I think Sacramento was correctly observed to be is that there was a lot of decision making that took place only within the four walls of City Hall. And so we established a formal body that's called the Community the Equity and Inclusive Economic Development and Community Development Committee. And it's made up of up to 25 individuals from the community who were selected to actively give advice. So they had expertise, whether it's on housing, whether it's on small business, whether it's on small business finance, a lot of different areas, social engagement with our communities, so that we in the city manager's office, and it was created very deliberately to give a voice to the city manager for a broader community, so that as we, as the city manager's office, brought forth programs, policies, projects, and ideas, whether generated from the city council, where they say, hey, we want you to do this, or whether generated by staff or the community saying, wouldn't it be great if the city did this program or looked at this, so that in fact it was a sounding board, so that when we went back to city council and said, we heard you and here's how we want to proceed, we got input. That was one piece. Secondly, we've been very deliberate about everything that this body does is reflected, even though we didn't establish it as here in California, we call it the Brown Act. Illinois has similar things, which are about transparency in government. We still treat it as such. We are very deliberate about communicating. We added to my staff and in economic development, we doubled the size of the staff. A good part of that doubling was creating a community engagement division that could be much more tuned to what's going on and what's our role in very discrete neighborhoods in the districts throughout Sacramento. Sacramento has 8 legislative districts with council members and the mayor. So we continue to do this. Most recently, this was tested, and I think quite well, in the city's disposition of its federal funding, first in the Community Relief Act, the CRF funding that the city received, some $49 million. This was at the very start of the pandemic as part of some of the initial actions that Congress took. And then subsequently, and now through the American Recovery program, where we are very deliberate about being iterative with council, vetting through our communities, putting everything as we go out for solicitations for funding online. We also just recently launched a communication program to greatly expand the number of languages we are communicating to our community in. We have a very large Asian community that's bifurcated among many different Asian ethnicities and nationalities. So lots of efforts. I think it's just about being deliberate.
Okay. What will you do to support small businesses in Evanston and to attract businesses to fill vacancies in commercial properties?
It's a challenge, I think, that every city is facing with right now. The pandemic amplified changes that were happening in retail, and particularly, I'll stick to retail first, storefronts, the changing nature of retail, especially ground floor retail on it. The pandemic amplified that. To some degree, to some benefit, right? Neighborhoods experienced more flow of traffic than downtowns because people stayed close to home. Part of it is tools. So Evanston has what we no longer have in California, which it has tax increment finance districts as a way of funding facade programs, other kinds of operating assistance on a limited basis to businesses addressing needs, particularly in this day and age right now during the pandemic, about how do you help businesses keep open as much as possible, lowering the regulatory barriers for businesses. We did substantial changes as a result of the pandemic to promote, for instance, alfresco dining. We then expanded it to all businesses, providing them with grants and other kinds of things for heaters, for blockades to be able to take over some of the public way. But the thing we also learned from that is we believe a lot of those changes are here to stay. So we are making changes to our building codes, our public way codes, to make it accessible and continue that long after we are hopefully out of this pandemic in this year. Hopefully, I think we all thought we might be out at the end of last year. I think P-bids are incredibly important. I know that Evanston has a fair number. Their chambers of commerce are incredibly important, particularly for reaching our ethnic and minority communities where there may be language barriers. But once again, it's being out in the community, responding to the needs that are seen. There are actual active measures. Loan programs are valuable. Grant programs are valuable. The challenge with those are obviously resourcing. So as much as possible, trying to accrue those resourcing.
Okay. Thank you. Please explain how you decide budgetary priorities. In other words, which projects and programs receive funding when resources are limited?
Well, fortunately, I don't do that alone here as the assistant city manager, nor my city manager. This is where working very closely with the council and the community becomes important. One of the things that I say, what is the role of the city managers in helping to figure out budget priorities? Well, it's working very closely with council to better understand where the council priorities are. Now, we're not indifferent in that conversation. We in the city manager's office will bring in expertise of staff and resources to help inform the council and the mayor as it's looking at its priorities as what are the most viable, what yield the most revenue impact with respect to it. We go through a very deliberate budget process here in Sacramento. We actually go through a twice a year budget process. We do the annual budget where we work with all the departments. All the departments do their submissions on top of a base budget. And then we as assistant city managers that represent all the departments from police to public works to convention and tourism to economic development, then look at those asks and rationalize what make the most sense. But we also react and help inform the very real input we get from the mayor, especially, but also council individually and collectively to propose that budget that as much as possible reflects the priorities that they're identifying, that takes into account the existing obligations and opportunities that we as staff in the city manager's office may take, that also reflects the values of our community. So it is a very iterative process, but we don't do it solo. We do this very much in concert with the mayor and council, and by extension, our broader community residents.
Thank you. The city has paid exorbitant prices for some projects in the past. And then the quality is subpar that requires expensive fixes. How would you prevent this from happening in the future?
Sure, and if I can ask a clarifying question with respect to that, is that meant in terms of municipal projects, i.e. a city hall that's owned by the city, or are these public-private partnerships where there's a component of public funding?
I think there's been a few projects, some municipal and some partner projects. So, yeah.
Well, I think first and foremost is you start with the premise of what exactly is the city's interest in the project? What does it want to get out of it, right? So clearly defined projects and making sure that those projects make sense, whether they're a privately funded project that the city or privately initiated project that the city is participating in. They may be providing tax tip financing into it, or it's a public works project. We're building a new community center. So number one, making sure the project makes sense, making sure the project has been well analyzed with respect to cost becomes critically important. And what is the expectation of the city on that? If it's a public project, it is important that either through internal staff or if there's limited capacity simply because of whatever reason, budgetary, et cetera, for external staff, doing really real scrubs about, what's the cost of the project? Are there ways to control the cost? Are there ways to figure out other forms of financing? It's something we actively do here in Sacramento. We actively did that in DC on the public side. On the private side, private initiated project, especially because I know, given my past experience having run the TIF program for the city of Chicago and been very active with whether it's tax incentives or some of the other financing programs at Cook County, making sure that there is a clear understanding of what does the municipality and do the residents consider a win from that project. Just building it isn't necessarily enough. You can have a great project that looks great, even budgetarily was a great project, but doesn't yield the win for the community that the community was looking after, whether that's through contracts and other mechanisms to help build it, whether it's about hiring on the job or future hiring in with respect to the project. So it's being clear-eyed about what the objective of the city is. That requires good staff, and it requires the staff working closely with those elected representatives that are in those areas to fully understand what's the goal, what's our win, right? I think that's always important to be able for the city individually, city manager or an elected official to say, here's what a win is. would be for us. And holding those developers, including ourselves, if it's a public project, accountable. Guaranteed maximum contracting, other kinds of forms of ways of ensuring that there's limitations on cost overruns, and who bears that cost overrun, I think are critically important. We could probably spend a day speaking on this topic, but
Okay, thank you. What will you do to improve productivity, service, and accountability with city staff? And if you could give some examples from your previous positions as to how you did this.
Sure. So I think, once again, being clear-eyed about objectives and metrics for what is expected out of staff. So, for instance, we have and cities, whether it was Chicago, whether it was Cook County, whether it was DC, whether it's Sacramento, have all grappled with ways to accurately reflect and communicate to the public performance metrics. What are things that we value that we want the public to know? I think for departments, putting in performance metrics as a way of helping departments think about how are you going to deliver the value that you think you need to deliver, whether it's in a public works project, whether it's in an economic development project, and being transparent to elected leaders, being transparent to the public about what those will be, and living up to them. So the first thing is, you can't fix what you can't measure. And you definitely need to measure, but you shouldn't, but I don't think you also should necessarily manage just to the measurement, because that's a way of maybe solving a numbers problem, but at the end of the day, still not delivering the value that the community is seeing in a project or from a department. But I do think performance management is a very important start. I would think Evanston has some form of performance management in how rigorous it is, how it's used in the decision-making process by the city manager and elected officials. I'm not familiar with, but that's an important place to start.
Thank you. The city's portion of the property tax is higher than neighboring communities. What strategies would you look at to make the city's share of the property tax more manageable?
So this is a challenge that I'm very familiar with from my work at Cook County. There's a reality with respect to Cook County's taxation system, is that it is structurally inequitable across the county. And by extension, that's also true of Northeastern Illinois, but certainly the county, that we know that some communities, historically, the southern communities in Cook County have borne, a disproportionate share. That was also true of the North and Northwest communities, especially vis-a-vis Chicago. So I think the first thing is Evanston, along with some other communities, being leaders in the conversation with the county assessor, realizing that there's underlying an inequitable situation, because the reality is that Evanston can't change its taxation system alone. It definitely involves the county assessor's office, by extension, the county, but principally the county assessor's office, on trying to look at a more equitable system. I understand that there are some efforts underway with respect to that. It seems like some of those may be hard hitting certain communities like Evanston. And then the other piece is as it looks at advancing a position and arguing that position to the assessor's office and ultimately the state with respect to the structural inequities on its taxation system, is looking at, for instance, it's very important to grow the economy, growing jobs that'll be in Evanston, growing residents that are in Evanston. I think some of the other measures that things like the city of Chicago, and I don't know what to what extent Evanston has been able to take advantage of this, particularly with marginalized community, whether there are exemptions on the homeowner basis that may be available or that may be pursued on the local basis, I think is one piece. I think that the city, like many cities in Cook County, are challenged by their individual levies. So the only place you can go to some degree are special special sales taxes and various other things, which I know are not attractive. So I'd be wary to go there. I don't think you can tax yourself out of the condition. So you either need to fix some of the structural issues, those are county, address some of the immediate resident issues, if there's possibilities for exemptions that may be pursued, particularly for those that are at risk, homeowners particularly. But it's a problem that I think Evanston can lead on. not just to the benefit of Evanston, but in fact, the benefit of many communities across the county.
Thank you. What do you think the city's role with Northwestern University should be? And talk about your experiences working with colleges and universities.
Sure. And, so first of all, I recognize that the presence of a university like Northwestern, which is a great international institution, is both it's a plus, it's a huge asset, it's a huge intellectual base, it employs a lot of people directly in Evanston. But it also has the potential to be an albatross, or at least perceived as an albatross by the community, because it doesn't pay property taxes in general. And this is not unique to Evanston. Here in Sacramento, we have two large state institutions that sit within the city of Sacramento. We have Sac State, which is part of the California state system, and we have the medical campus for the University of California, Davis, which is the third largest university, University of California institutions in the state of California, and a major research institution. So fundamentally, I do approach it that the university is an asset. But I also realize that in that asset being there are many residents that don't necessarily see the benefit of the university being in the community. So I think part of it is the conversation and a real working relationship with the university to figure out how the university can be leveraged to the benefit of Evanston in terms of job creation that actually stays in Evanston, job and business creation that stays in Evanston. Number one. So one of the things we've done here with the University of California, Davis, the university is pursuing $1.5 billion investment in a medical campus. Sorry, not a medical campus. It's basically a life sciences co-location campuses that they're fostering private businesses that are being developed out of spin-offs from the university and are generating jobs. So we expect that process to generate about 5,000 direct jobs here in the city of Sacramento, adjoining one of our most historically marginalized community, a community by the name of Oak Park, and not at all like Oak Park in Illinois. So one of the things we are putting in place with the university are certain anti-gentrification strategies, funding through California's existing version of tax increment finance to fund a home repair program for existing residents so that they're not displaced. But fundamentally, it's a great thing. That $1.5 billion investment in our community that's going to generate 5,000 jobs, 40% of those that are estimated not to require a college degree, is a good thing for the city. Working on those things in partnership with the university is critically important. It's fundamentally built on trust. It's fundamentally built on a relationship. And it's fundamentally built on respect by both parties, by the university and the town and the city as a whole, that this is an asset, even if it hasn't been fully leveraged as an asset in the past.
Thank you. Talk about your experience in coming up with strategies to reduce crime, and how could you apply that in Evanston?
Well, so I've had, as part of the city management team here in Sacramento, we work very closely with my colleagues, the other assistant city managers. We have one for public safety and the police department and the fire. We recently created a new department. It was originally thought of as an office of community response. And initially, this was meant to be an office that sat in the city manager's office that responded from a de-escalation strategy with respect to trying to lower the amount of police involvement on things that didn't warrant a direct police involvement. More recently, it's also expanded into an issue that we find that is huge in Sacramento, which is homelessness and encampments and how it relates to code enforcement around businesses and so on. I do think this strategy makes a lot of sense, i.e. expanding what we broadly consider how we mitigate for things that are low level. They may be low level offenses. They may not. They may require different community engagement, but they're intimately tied. So when we have this conversation of rethinking policing our communities, it's a multiple layer conversation. It's not just about more fund or less funding necessarily to policing and more funding to social services. It is really figuring out how those two elements within our city, those two areas under the direction of the city manager and ultimately the council and mayor, function to provide safety in our community, provide a sense of respect in our communities. And every place is grappling with it. It's been a huge struggle here in California, in Sacramento. But I do believe has to be a multi-pronged approach where it's not policing here and social service engagement here, that they are tied as we think about how we provide better safety, security, and resources in our community.
Thank you. Michael, Evanston is a very active citizenry, a lot of contentious issues. Talk about your experience dealing with those type of issues.
Sure. Well, the more I was very familiar with Evanston, but the more I get to know Evanston through this process, the more I realize that Evanston and Sacramento have a lot in common. We are a very informed citizenry, very active citizenry, partly because we are the state capital of the largest state in the union, 40 million residents in California, and most of the policy making that happens in California happens in Sacramento. So we have a very active kind of populace. One of the things we do is we run a citizen academy that every year has in 2 sessions, I think somewhere between 25 and 40 individuals, where they work with our planning department, other departments to better fundamentally understand how the city works, what we can do, what we can't do, what are the challenges on that. Many of those individuals then go on or are coming from our various boards and commissions, because we realize that an informed citizenry is a much better partner with respect to government as we move things forward. If they understand some of our challenges, one, we get their collective brain power in terms of how we think about things, and 2, they better understand our challenges as management. We have a very active city council. We have, so I don't know about Evanston, but we have, when I first came here, we had city council meetings every Tuesday, virtually throughout the year. And those city council meetings regularly ran well into the evening. We've now kind of lessened those somewhat, but our typical month is about 2 to 3 city council meetings. We have a very kind of vocal city council membership. And I appreciate as the city manager that, or coming in the city manager's office, is that we're responsive to everyone on the city council and the mayor. But I also think it's incumbent upon us in the city manager's office to deploy the resources that we can, our professional staff across the departments and agencies, to help inform the council as they think about their policy making.
Thank you. Talk about experiences you've had in previous work in acquiring grant funding for various projects.
So as a city here in Sacramento, when I was with the Cook County, when at the city of Chicago, we actively pursued grants or the vehicle to pursue grants. One of the things that we led when I was at Cook County was an application to the Economic Development Administration, which is part of the Department of Commerce, to be designated for all of Northeastern Illinois. So we in Cook County coalesced a lot of municipalities, but also the 6 collar counties in an application to be designated what's called an Investing in Manufacturing Community Partnerships, IMCP. It didn't bring money of itself. What it did bring is a preferential rating system for federal grants in other areas, and that did help bring money for instance, a $5 million DoD study in terms of study and mitigation for communities and industries that were impacted by base foreclosures and less spending in defense. We also pursued actively funding and deployed a lot of funding. I've been in my personal experience involved some very big grants. When I was with Cook County, we had, I want to say, an $89 million CDBG disaster recovery program that we launched across the county. Here in Sacramento, we've been managing initially a $49 million from federal funding, ARP kind of program. as well as subsequently the CRF funding, Community Relief Program, and then ARPA, funding to the city, which we received 112 million. We're fortunate here in Sacramento, and the state of California has in the past 2 years been somewhat resource rich, having surpluses last year about 71 billion, this year about 27 billion. So there's a lot of funding that is still competitive applying for, whether it's for housing, whether it's for rental assistance. And we've been pretty successful areas that fall under my leadership in applying for those fundings for the city, or equally as important, applying in partnership with other entities, community-based organizations, not-for-profits, in seeking funding for a variety of things, from housing to special programming to grants funding to arts funding. So I think it's important for the city to be very active in that. And that activity doesn't necessarily mean that the city is always doing it. At times, we're a lead partner, or we're just part of a partnership pursuing that. And I think that's really important also for the city to realize it doesn't have to, nor should it do everything on its own. Partnership is incredibly important, whether it's with our businesses, whether it's with our philanthropic. And when I say our philanthropic, I don't just mean in Evanston. The Chicago area is rich in philanthropic organizations or other communities.
Okay, thank you. Evanston used to be a place where people from the North Shore came in for dining, shopping, and culture. How do you think we can bring back the vitality we used to have as we exit the pandemic?
Well, I think fundamentally it starts with making it clear as a community that you want that back. So we take that as a given, but that isn't necessarily always given. We're similarly focused or have that challenge here in Sacramento. Huge amount of our workforce is state workforce, and right now in the pandemic and continuing on, they're not here. They're not in our downtown, so they're not going and eating in our restaurants. All these other things. I think working in partnership with your business, retail, restaurant industry is critically important. We talked about this a little bit earlier. What can the city do that lowers barriers that fall under the responsibility of the city? What can the city do in helping to support funding that may not be available just through the city? There's lots of other resources that came to play that we leveraged that was beyond the city in terms of helping to provide everything from heaters to barricades to various other things, and we then reduced the regulatory barrier. We just launched as part of our ARPA funding, a buy local program, where in fact we are partnering with a gift card program, where if you buy cards for buying retail or going to restaurants in the city, we are using some of our ARPA funding. So if you buy $100 towards a gift card that can be used at businesses that participate in the city, we, the city, are adding on another $100 on top of that, or $50 on top of that, depending on the level, so that you get a bonus for spending local in our community. And that's one of the things we are using a relatively minor portion, but it's critically important. And it was also important that while we started with a downtown focus on that, simply because they had launched a similar program about 2 years ago, and so they had a lot of the infrastructure in place. We are expanding that across our commercial corridors in the city and trying to get as many businesses signed up to this program as possible, so that it truly is driving we call it, in our case, it's Shop 916. 916 is our area code. I think things like that, partnering. And I'm going to be honest, this is a program that was first started by our downtown bids, but we partnered with them to figure out how to expand this, not just from the bids, but across the city.
Thank you.
Sorry, bids, by the way, business improvement districts,
yeah.
for those that don't know.
I'm going to hit, there's a few questions in the chat room specifically for you. Could you talk about you've had a number of positions, your career progression, and what you anticipate your commitment would be to Evanston in terms of the time frame?
So I guess I would start first. It's a function of how long Evanston's commitment is to me. So I take it as a given that we each get to know each other and move forward. I moved out to Sacramento because it was a unique opportunity. But I'm now in a position is that if I go back to Chicago, my intent is to stay in the Chicago area, Evanston, being an iconic community in that context. For the rest. Honestly, for the rest of my professional career at this stage, I'm not saying I'm on the verge of retiring tomorrow. I'm not. But I think that commitment is for as long as the city and the city council will have me, and vice versa. If we're being productive together in creating the community that I truly think Evanston wants to be, and I truly believe can be, I think we'll see out a number of terms of mayor and council members and be there in the community for a while.
Sure. There's questions on your TIF experience. So you may be aware there's a recently passed TIF in the 5th Ward in Evanston. How have the TIFs that you've worked on improved affordable housing and/or reduced poverty?
So I guess I'll start with the first fundamental. So I have done a lot of TIF programming. I did a lot of TIF programming. I developed and ran the program in DC. I headed up the area of the city of Chicago that had TIFs, and no city in the United States uses TIFs as much as Chicago does. Here in California, ironically, the state that created tax increment finance was also the first state to get rid of tax increment finance. And the reason was for budgetary reasons across the state. We now have a program that's called Enhanced Infrastructure Finance Districts, which is basically like a TIF light. But I guess where I was going with this is that at the end, I first started off with the fundamental premise that a TIF is a tool. A TIF does not make a good project bad, or does not necessarily make a bad project good. It's a way of financing projects, and it can make a lot of sense. The challenge with affordable housing and tax increment finance is that fundamentally TIFs work off future taxes that pay for current improvements. Affordable housing, for the most part, is tax exempt, so it doesn't generate tax in and of itself. So it doesn't generate. What it does do, though, is if it can foster revitalization around a community, that community, if it's part of the TIF district, as those taxes increase, and it's not a special tax, it's not a new tax, just normal tax, can help fund other kinds of improvement. So it's not the greatest of tools for affordable housing, but that having been said, you can use it depending on, especially if you're looking at a larger area for a tax increment finance district. I was familiar that Evanston, I believe, has 5 TIF districts, if I'm not mistaken. Perhaps this one is the 6th. I think there's a lot of reasons to think about how you use the tool and make sure that when you use the tool, you're getting the objective that you want to get out of it. I think Illinois was right not to get rid of the tool, tax increment finance. There's been a lot of conversations of Illinois of how to reform the TIF so that it truly does benefit residents in terms of jobs, as well as kind of other things that the community needs. Supporting small businesses is an example that comes to mind, and not simply funding projects, which are great. The project looks great, but it's hard to see what is the direct benefit for residents. So we have partnered when I was at Cook County with some affordable housing projects in Evanston. The names escape me right now, but it's a huge issue. There is a potential for using tax increment finance, but it's not the most obvious tool in that conversation.
Thank you. How would you engage the youth, especially minorities and youth who are not into academics, of Evanston more?
Well, I think one of the things, so it's one of the things we actually struggled with when I was at Cook County, and that we really focused on as part of the designation for the Investing Manufacturing Community Partnerships. Because as an example, we know that there are a lot of pathways for young kids that lead to very good paying jobs that you can sustain a family on ultimately, that you can learn trades, etc. that do not require a college degree. That's not to say they don't require training. And it doesn't mean to say that you don't need to stay in school, because I will tell anyone that's listening, math is important with respect to anything you're going into, especially in the trades and manufacturing. But I think it's figuring out that there's a lot of things that can be exciting for young people that are not the things that people traditionally look at, and in terms of pathways of ultimately jobs and so on, appreciating that there's lots of ways to advance one's life and careers. I think things like mentoring, really looking at how you support families is critically important. This is why I think some of the efforts, whether it's Head Start programs, lots of the other programs for particularly young people are critically important. But I'm not going to pretend it's an expertise that I come with naturally. What I do think I bring is an ability to work with and listen to community, listen to those people that have a lot of expertise, and I'm not afraid to explore programs and develop programs in that context that begin to address these issues.
Thank you. One of the initial tasks of the new city manager will be to hire a police chief. What would be the types of attributes and qualities and experiences that you would be looking for in a police chief for Evanston?
Well, obviously, police experience working in complex communities is going to be critically important. I think the same questions you're asking that have been asked of me, experience working with diverse communities, experience listening, leading, I think are critically important to a police chief. Experience in understanding, kind of where policing is heading and the desires of community that are asking, our police departments to number one, it's acknowledging that they're critically important, right? Public safety is critically important. Two, acknowledging that we often ask our police departments to do more than they were ever equipped or trained to do. But three, realizing that we need to support that through other efforts that are not just straight policing. There are other mitigation strategies as we move forward. So number one, asking those same questions of an individual coming and experience working in complex communities. I think there's a tremendous difference. Evanston is a community of 75,000, I believe, 70, 80,000, thereabouts. There are lots of communities at that size that are dramatically different. One of my attractions of Evanston is a real city. Evanston has real issues in that front, and you're going to want a police chief that's coming in knowing that. This is not a suburban kind of perspective. This is a complex environment, and I would want someone that's coming in the door that way. I think empathy towards a community. I think love for the community, wanting to be out there. I was fortunate about 2 weeks ago, I attended the graduation ceremony for our police academy. And for context, the Sacramento Police Academy doesn't just train for Sacramento. It trains the sheriff's office for the county of Sacramento, about 40 some communities in Northern California. And I will tell you to a T, I believe every one of those people want to serve their communities. And the way to foster that, though, is to foster individuals that realize that service comes in many forms and not in isolation just to what they do as officers of the law. So I think it's a very important process. I'd also want to make sure that it's a very active engagement with the mayor and council and community. And that doesn't necessarily mean a direct interview from the community, but it does mean that the community has a voice in identifying what it values.
Thank you. Michael, we're getting close to our time to wrap up here. So is there anything you would like to add, maybe that we didn't ask, or anything as a wrap up to the community members on here today?
No, I think other than, I think my resume and background probably speaks to itself. I think my experience in the Chicago area working in diverse communities, whether it's in the Southland, at the city of Chicago, but also working across the nation demonstrates my ability that I'm a quick learner. I'm intellectually, very, very curious. I think there's lots of things that you learn from operating and working in other environments that then become applicable to a place like Evanston that I'd be anxious to explore both with the mayor, the city council, and the community at large. the Chicago area is home for me. I grew up there. Most of my family is there. So there's definitely a tug of home. And I think if I were to take that step to returning back to the area, the place I would want to do it would be an iconic community like Evanston.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. I look forward to meeting more members of the public and city council and mayor further. Thank you.
Yes. Look forward to seeing you out this week. Pam, any wrap-up comments?
No, thank you so much, Michael, for joining us today. As we've mentioned to everyone, the candidates will be in Evanston the end of the week on Thursday and Friday. And so, certainly if you have additional feedback, we've showed the link many times, but it should be shared on the city's website for you to go and give feedback on the candidates' performances today, no later than tomorrow morning, hopefully possibly by this evening as well. But I would look for that no later than tomorrow. But certainly we have recorded all of your chat as well, so that the council will have the ability to, council members, who maybe did not have the opportunity to view today, it will be on the city's website so that they can look at it, and other members of the public who were not able to view today's town hall will be able to watch this video as well. But again, thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to the further activities the rest of the week.